Good morning. How are you today? I am wonderful. After more than 40 years in ministry, I have preached more than 2,500 sermons. And we are down to the last two. Guy comes up to me at the traditional service, looks me up and down, and he says, "I can see you are a short timer." He looks down and he says, "You're not even wearing socks." That's what I love about this church. Truly, it is always such an adventure. And I'm thrilled that you're here today. Perhaps you have heard the quote attributed to Mark Twain. According to the legend, he read in the newspaper his own obituary and responded that reports of his death were greatly exaggerated. Wow. As in so many historic things, that's not quite right. He received an inquiry from a reporter of a New York paper asking if he was dying and bankrupt. And he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So he actually crafted a very heartfelt response. Twain wrote, "I can understand perfectly how the report of my illness got about. I have even heard on good authority that I was dead. James Ross Clemens, a cousin of mine, who was bankrupt, by the way, was seriously ill 2 or 3 weeks ago in London, but is well now. The report of my illness grew out of his illness. The report of my death was an exaggeration." For all my years of ministry, I have been hearing reports of the death of the church. You are evidence of how wrong that is. It's really not surprising. Reports of God's death date back centuries. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote more than 130 years ago that Gott ist tot. God is dead. Well, Nietzsche's dead, but God seems to be doing really well. And the thing is, it didn't end with Nietzsche, of course. It was 1966 and the Beatles were being interviewed, and John Lennon chimed in. "Christianity will go," he said. "It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity," he said to the interviewer. Now, it didn't make much of a stir in England, but it certainly did here in the States. And when the Beatles toured months later, there were venues that were essentially empty, according to Rolling Stone. People just didn't go to hear them. And Rolling Stone said that they never toured the States again as the Beatles. I'll tell you the reality. Let me just spell it out. The church is on trial today. And the evidence, well, you have to weigh the evidence, and we will. Because it is provocative and it is intriguing. But what you need to remember is the church has always been on trial. From its inception almost 2,000 years ago until today, skeptics and cynics are looking. They're looking for evidence that refutes what we say because of what we do. Of course, one of the early trials was of Paul, the apostle, the great ambassador of the church. We have this amazing account in Acts chapter 17 of Paul before the learned scholars and the court in Athens. Now, Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, distills down the entire interaction down to about 2 minutes. And people therefore conclude that it was nothing more than a philosophical discussion, a debate with the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers of the day. That would be misreading the historical context. In fact, N.T. Wright says it so well. This was not a philosophical debate, he wrote. The Areopagus, that's Mars Hill, the Areopagus was a court. It's actually where Socrates was tried and found guilty of corrupting the youth. Paul was on trial. It was a dangerous moment. It could have gone badly wrong. Paul was undoubtedly on trial. We don't know if it was for his life. We do know that it was for his faith. What we misunderstand is we think this is something that happened a long time ago in a far distant place, and that would be wrong, dead wrong. Because the simple truth is, we all of us who claim the name Christian, follower of Jesus, are on trial. And Paul gives us an example of how best to defend not only ourselves, but our passionate belief that Jesus is not only the Son of God, but that he died for us, and that following Jesus is the only way to find life. Some scripture you read and you struggle with and you ask yourself, okay, that seems so tied to its historic context. What does it mean? What's the relevance? How does this apply to me? This text fairly leaps off the page and into our lives, and the relevance is so obvious. Come on. I've been saying that for 21 years. Come on. I want to take you to a passage of Scripture that stirs my soul and excites my heart. Let me show you. Let me take you to Acts chapter 17. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" And oh, make no mistake, there are people today who believe the same thing. Anything who says anything about God and faith is considered by some skeptics and cynics as nothing more than a babbler. He continues. Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Be clear, the earliest Christians were called atheists because we didn't believe in all the pagan cults, and certainly not the cult of deity that was applied to the emperors of Rome. We were called the atheists, detested and despised, persecuted. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. Now let's just stop there. They took him to a meeting of the Areopagus. What they mean is they took him to court. He was confronted by the authorities of the city. He was challenged for the teaching that he was offering. This wasn't a polite philosophical society. If you've been to Athens, and I hope you get a chance to go, you go to the Parthenon, and you can't get close to any of that. It's spectacular, but you're roped off. You can't get close. But the Areopagus, that's actually a rounded hill with a stone beneath on top, and it's where Socrates was tried. It's where Paul was tried, and you can actually walk on the rock, which is so cool. I remember standing there and gazing out over all of Athens, and it was spectacular. And I thought of Socrates, convicted of corrupting the youth, and I thought of Paul, persuasive in articulating and arguing his faith. They took him up and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, Mars Hill, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." Now, Luke inserts, parenthetically, an editorial comment at this point. All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. It was culturally fashionable. It was the salon of the day. Paul then stood up at a meeting of the Areopagus and said, now listen, this is where it gets really good. Because here we see the mind of Paul, divinely inspired, articulating the faith for a culture that is radically different. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. This is what I want to tell you about, he's saying, in essence. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. This is echoing the very words Paul uses repeatedly in his letters. God is the one who gives us life and breath and everything that is good and true, perfect and beautiful. People struggle with this because they look at evil and they say, well, what about evil? Didn't God create evil? No. Evil is the absence of God, the same way darkness is the absence of light. God did not create evil, we chose evil. And what that means is we chose a path that leads to the darkness where the light is prohibited. God created everything that is good and true and beautiful and perfect. Paul continues, from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. I love that. You see what Paul did? He studied the culture closely enough that he could quote from the poets, the Athenian poets, and he could use their lyrical verse to point beyond the reality of the moment to the God that we know through Jesus Christ. That is brilliant. And it is so loving and gracious. There is no defensiveness. There is only a decided, obvious graciousness. So let's unpack this, because we're really speaking of life and faith. And make no mistake, during our lifetime and every lifetime before and after since the time of Christ, the church has been under attack. And it is still under attack. Here's the simple truth. People of the world, people of our culture particularly, see the church and churchgoers as people who are arrogant, bigoted, harshly judgmental, coolly indifferent to the plight of people. They don't see the church as a blessing, they see it as a curse. They don't see the church as beneficial, they see it as pernicious. And if we're honest to God, we've got to admit there is evidence, there is some evidence against us. I'll always be straight and I'll always be truthful with you. That's why you'll never hear me say to be honest with you, because I don't want you to ever think there's a time I'm not honest with you. And every preacher should eradicate that phrase from their vocabulary. Let me tell it to you straight. I read the internet, I read the news, and every time I hear about a pastor who has an inappropriate relationship with a woman on his staff or in the choir or in the church, every time I read about a priest who has inappropriate contact with a child or minor. Every time I read about a pastor who cannot distinguish his own money from the church's money, or worse yet, a pastor who preaches a prosperity gospel and then leads a life that is so contrary to Christ, flying everywhere that they can rationalize as missional on their private jets, this appalls me. More than that, it breaks my heart because it reflects so poorly on all of us. Every time I hear about a church that talks about hating rather than loving, that talks about condemning rather than offering compassion and love, it breaks my heart because I look at Christ. And even though he never condoned the sin, he refused to condemn the sinner. He offered grace and forgiveness, and he reached out to the people who were at the farthest reaches. Oh, my friends, that is not the way the church is perceived in much of our culture today. And it breaks my heart for the way we are perceived. And it fills my heart with pride and joy when I look at you. Because it's not just the big dumb red truck that says for. It's what you do. It's how you live. It's how you give. It's how you sacrifice. And I see it when you take the lunches to hungry children. I see it when you reach out to the areas of most desperate need. And I see it when you generously support a ministry so that it can do more than any one of us could possibly do alone. What I love about Paul, what's so beautiful in this passage is he gives us a key insight on how we reach out to the world in such a way that we offer grace and love and forgiveness and hope in a hopeless, unforgiving, graceless culture. We have a chance to respond with compassion, not condemnation. Now, let me just be straight with you. I'm not the compassionate one in the family. I know. Everybody thinks the pastor is the compassionate one, right? No. Actually, pastors who lead large churches tend not to be gifted in the area of compassion, all right? They tend to be not just shepherds, but vision-casting ranchers that try to inspire people to do and be more than they ever imagined possible. People who are highly gifted in terms of compassion, they're the pastoral care specialists. They're the ones who love to go to the hospital, go to the nursing home, go to whatever place people are hurting. They tend not to grow churches. They tend to love churches. And one's not good or bad. It's just different. You got to understand, when it came to compassion, I got the short end of the stick. But that's on God, not me, okay? But I am gifted in that I married the most compassionate woman imaginable. I don't brag on my wife enough because she won't speak to me on the way home if I do. She's very quiet and reserved. But I got to tell you, what I lack in compassion, Marianne more than makes up for. I've told you the story. I mean, I don't know how it is with you, but when people do crazy things on the highway, in the restaurants, wherever you happen to be, when people are just really annoying and irritating, do you take that personally? Do you think they're doing that specifically to you? I do. Come on, fess up. When people drive crazy on the road and they cut me off, I think they are doing that on purpose. When people ignore me at a restaurant, I think they do that on purpose. When people are in front of me in the left turning lane and the light turns green and they stay there and they don't move, they intend to be obnoxious and annoying, right? Right? Are you with me? You see, my wife has a different perspective on life, thank God. And I've told you before, but it's so annoying. I had just finished my last chemo. And I'm driving, and somebody doesn't make the turn from the left lane across traffic with the arrow. And I'm just doing a slow burn that's quickly going to erupt into Vesuvius. You know what I'm talking about? a little out of proportion. And my wife, she turns to me and says, "Now, Jim, what if that person just finished chemo and they're sick? They're sick to their stomach and they're distracted and they're sitting in traffic. How would you feel if that was you and somebody was laying on their horn behind them?" And I'm thinking, oh, good God, really? She's preaching to the preacher here. And it's one of the best things she's ever done because she does it repeatedly. And I'll tell you, you know the real beautiful thing about my wife? She looks at the world and sees it through the eyes of Christ. And she looks at the people who are annoying and dares to say, "Why is that?" And she prays so she doesn't take it personally, but instead focuses on what's going on with the person. And you'd be amazed what you discover when you begin to look and listen. And instead of looking with condemnation, but look with compassion that looks for understanding, not indifference. Any of you read Kiplinger's retirement journal? I do. It's actually funny. It really is. You know, it's all about old people. That's funny. Come on, stay with me. And they had a recent article that just caught my eye, and I thought, oh, this is so good. I'm going to share this with the church. It was targeted for grandparents so that the grandparents could develop a sense of appreciation for their children or grandchildren's taste in music. Ooh, isn't that intriguing? Because we all know our taste in music was fixed probably around the age of 16, and we keep going back and think that's the best music that's ever been made. And this article was about how you can actually look at the music the kids, your grandkids listen to, and look for points of commonality. And it was fascinating. For instance, let me show you. If you like Joni Mitchell, it says, "Try Wise Blood." I did, and it was interesting. Or if you like Marvin Gaye, then it says, "Try Abraham Alexander." I haven't done that yet. But if you like Led Zeppelin, oh, come on, some of you like Led Zeppelin, then try Greta Van Fleet. Or this one I did. If you like Ella Fitzgerald, I love Ella Fitzgerald, try Samara Joy. Oh, and just in case there's anyone who likes Tupac, there's somebody clapping in the back. Yeah, you got to my guy. Try Burma Boy. Who thought you'd learn about cutting-edge music in church today? And I laughed. And I thought to myself, wow. Imagine if we studied the culture, not with an air of condescension, but looking for an element of commonality. What if we studied the culture in such a way that we could actually quote the poets of the day like Paul did in such a way so as to intrigue people about what we have found in life and love because of Christ? Because the last thing the church ever wants to be is coolly indifferent or cruelly condemning. The church ought to be the one place that mirrors Christ and opens wide its arms and says, come to me, all you who are burdened and beaten by life, because this is the place where you will find hope when you're hopeless, help when you're helpless, love when you feel hated, and grace when you feel despised. Because the whole purpose of the church is to reach out to the world in such a way and draw them, lead them into the presence of Christ. People keep saying to me, what are you going to do when you retire? I'm going to go fishing. I've got my fly rod strung up on the roof rack of my car. I already have the fly rod holder. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to go to Colorado and we're going to do some hiking. This was our last 14er. This is Gray's Mountain. And I love this picture because my wife is smiling while she's holding me up. Isn't that beautiful? I love hiking in Colorado. And you know why? because it's a curated experience. Have you ever thought about this? It's a curated experience. You can read about it, and they give you the mile markers and what to expect every step of the way. And then when you get to the trails, there is a trail. You don't have to break it yourself, because others have gone before me, and they have actually cleared and smoothed a trail so that I can find my way. And now you understand the purpose of the church. If going to be with Christ is the mountaintop, then our purpose is, as was Paul's, to be an ambassador who reaches out with compassion and understanding and offers hope, help, grace, and love. And what I love about this church, that is not only who we have been, it's who we will be by the grace of God. Amen? Pray with me.